Hello, I am Dr. Talia Charney, the Nutrition and Health Education Manager for PureSource, and today I will be doing a category training on the topic of probiotics. Notice this incredible picture of our microbiome in the digestive tract. The microbiome is defined as a commensal microbial population residing in humans, which is both persistent and stable and does not elicit an acute immune response. Our microbiome is incredibly diverse, so even though we may think that the probiotic we take has a lot of strains, for example, you might find one with 10 or 12 strains, this is really nothing in comparison to the natural diversity. There are at least 100,000 billion bacteria in our human microbiome that have been identified. They're divided into families. So, for example, I'm showing here the Lactobacillus family. There's the Bifidobacteria family as well. Those two are two families that you will often find in probiotics. The families are then divided into species, and we know of 2,000 of those, and furthermore into specific strains. You will notice the first strain out of 7,000 here has in brackets LA-1. So that is how you can note the specific strain on the food, on the probiotic label. Another way of looking at our microbiome in terms of how vast it is to know that there are 10 times more bacteria in our intestines than we have body cells. The weight of that microbiome is on average 1.5 kilograms. Most of that comes from the large intestines. Even though when we take probiotics therapeutically, we are mostly working with the small intestines. This 1.5 kilograms is approximately the weight of our liver or our brain. Here are some other interesting facts. We produce up to 4 liters of gas on a daily basis. About 15% of our fecal matter is bacteria. So that means that when we have our stool, there is flux, there's a loss and replacement of bacteria. 80% of our immune system occurs in the digestive tract. So it's the number one primer to drive the immune system to act quickly and appropriately. These bacteria are located on mucosal surfaces of our oral cavity, respiratory tract, GI, urinary tract, and on our skin as well. When it comes to probiotics, they are domesticated varieties of bacteria. They are slightly altered in their phenotype from their wild-type counterparts because they are grown in a domesticated ecosystem versus the more competitive wild situation that naturally occurs. It's kind of like dog breeding or growing hydroponic fruits and vegetables. The small and large intestine are quite different. Firstly, in the number of bacteria that they host. There are millions of bacteria in the small intestines, which may sound like a lot, but there are billions in the large intestines. So the large intestines are much more heavily populated. Also, metaphorically, the small intestines, when it comes to a bacteria entering and trying to take root in the small intestines, it's more like having somebody flowing through a very fast river and trying to cling onto a rock. And if there is somebody else already clinging onto that rock, it would not be available. So it's a very quick transit time. The large intestines is more like if you were treading water, trying to stay in place in a slow drifting river. And you can also sort of crowd in with others. So there's a lot more bacteria in the large intestines, and it can sort of layer on top of one another. Although a microbiome is generally considered stable over time, there still is a shifting, particularly from birth to the age of about 2 or 3. We're born with a sterile GI, and the average child by the age of 2 or 3 eating the standard American diet has a microbiome that reflects the average adult. By the age of 50, however, we tend to lose Lactobacilli and Bifidobacterium, and this can result in lower immune function. For formula-fed babies by day 7, their microbiome looks quite different to those who are breastfed. Only 22% of their flora are the desirable Bifidobacterium that you would normally see in the majority, and there are 78% approximately of less desirable organisms such as E. coli. By 19 weeks, studies show that a lot of that Bifidobacterium does increase up to about 75%, but they never fully catch up, and these children are generally more likely to develop certain conditions such as colitis. Antibiotic use can also be disruptive to the microbiome. Some believe that antibiotics can kill up to 90% of beneficial microbes in the small intestines. Of course, it may depend on the strength, the type of antibiotic, the length it's taken. Lactobacilli and Bifidobacteria are especially sensitive to antibiotics. And what occurs is that the resistant organisms tend to thrive, which is what we call dysbiosis. So we might find organisms like C. difficile thriving, and this can lead to issues such as diarrhea. There is a strong association between antibiotic use and the development of irritable bowel syndrome. So when one takes antibiotics, we follow a certain protocol that generally comes out of the information gained from 2 major randomized controlled trials. And that is that probiotics are given within 10 days following antibiotics. Now they can also taken at the same time but 3 hours apart. But they should be taken as soon as possible, and then the flora is able to return to normal within about 28 days on average. Here's just a representation of some of the many details that are different between the microbiome of a vaginal birth inoculation and a C-section. So you can see with a vaginal birth, we have 90% of lactobacilli, which mainly comes from the mother's vaginal canal. In contrast, a baby born by C-section has mostly staphylococci, and this comes from the skin of the nurses and the mother and other ways. With a C-section, even 7 years later, a child will have atypically high levels of staphylococci bacteria and a higher incidence of obesity and allergies. There are potential future therapies that are showing to be promising, where a vaginal swab from the mother is used to inoculate the baby born by C-section. And it is also thought that the first 6 months from birth is a key window of opportunity to try and to quote-unquote fix the situation and inoculate the infant. So we've talked about the microbiome and defined it. Well, what are probiotics? They are living microorganisms, not just bacteria, but we primarily, in the form of probiotics, do give bacteria, but they can also be yeast or even viruses. But they're live microorganisms which, when administered in adequate amounts, confer health benefits on the host. You might be thinking, how do they work with so few? Because, for example, you might get a probiotic that has 3 billion, but our large intestines has many more bacteria than that. Well, that is because they work mostly on the small intestines. In the small intestines, where we only have millions in numbers, a 25 billion probiotic can swamp the small intestines. In order to affect the colon, some experts believe you need quite massive doses. So when is the best time to take a probiotic? You might have heard different opinions, but by and large, during a meal is the best time. This is because the pH level rises typically because of the buffering effect of foods during a meal, from the fasting pH, which is quite acidic, between 1.8 to 3.6, up to about 3.8 to 4.3, and this is a more ideal pH range in which the probiotics can survive. Now, if a probiotic is enteric coated, then this may not matter in terms of the timing. But these days, because of our advanced methods and ability to grow resistant strains, it's not really necessary to use enteric coating. It's more expensive, and there are more additives that are necessary. So which strains are the best strains? We're always seeking the best. Well, the truth is that most strains are very similar when it comes to probiotics, when compared to the overall diversity in our commensal community, our natural community. Also, most strains have never been compared head-to-head in human clinical trials, which is really the only way that we can make such a claim. And lastly, although there are many studies on probiotic, it is such an exciting area, there are still large gaps in study design. So what I can say is it's difficult to make definitive strain-specific recommendations. And there is no one strain or combination ideally suited for each and every individual or clinical outcome. In fact, it's important to note that our microbiomes are all very different, almost like your fingerprint. They're different because of our diets, our genetics, family background, and all kinds of other factors, environmental and innate. So what do probiotics do, generally speaking? There are many things that probiotics are known to do, and we're learning more and more. Most probiotics have a broad range of effects on our digestive tract, as listed here. So they may help with colonization resistance, the production of short-chain fatty acids, increase the speed of the GI lining renewal, and so on. Many of them are also known to synthesize vitamins, reinforce the gut barrier, metabolize bile, and other activities. And a few of them are even known to have neurological, immunological, endocrinological effects. You might have heard the following statement, that probiotic strains must and should be originally isolated from the human gut in order to be beneficial. I believe that this is false. We can actually source and get helpful benefits from probiotics, from human strains, bacterial strains, food, soil, and even breast milk. In fact, we can't even really say if we so-called source a probiotic from the human being, whether or not it actually originated there, because our own bacteria in our gut can come from breast milk, could have come from soil, from foods, and so on. What goes into making a probiotic effective? Well, an effective probiotic, regardless of where it is sourced, must be able to pass a number of hurdles. First, strain isolation. Most gastrointestinal strains have yet to be isolated and grown. Next, genetic identity. Many of the probiotics will differ by small genetic differences, and we need to be able to identify them. And in fact, Now brand does genetic identification, which is a rare test in its own laboratories, which I will get to. Staying power. The probiotics need to be resistant to things that could destroy them, like stomach acid or enzymes or bile, so that they can stick around for long enough. There's also biological effects, of course. That's by definition for probiotics. They should have some type of a known positive effect. Ideally, they have human clinical trials. They also need to be commercially viable. They may seem to be great, but if they don't have the capacity to be grown in large quantities for the public, then they may not be able to be part and parcel of a probiotic. And lastly, they need to be delivered to the consumer having followed good manufacturing practices. So whether we're looking at shipping, refrigeration, avoiding heat, light, and oxygen or moisture that can destroy them, and also using overage, which means adding additional probiotics into a capsule so that by the expiry date, the amount on the bottle is met. Always advise your customers about best practices when it comes to probiotics. That means, firstly, letting them know that shelf life is always enhanced by refrigeration before you've opened up the bottle. So even if they buy a shelf-stable version, it will still last longer in the refrigerator. Secondly, the shelf life diminishes dramatically once opened. So it's best to consume it quickly within 1 to 2 months. It's generally believed by most experts that focusing on diversity of strains is a good idea. So that's why we have supplements that have 8 to 10 strains in them, generally speaking. But sometimes we use one specific or two specific strains, so more of a narrow range, because this is based on particular studies. And in that case, that's fine, but it's still considered a good idea, generally speaking, to rotate the strains. It is generally believed that probiotics are quite a low-risk therapy. Here I'm showing you just the general description of risk that you will see on a probiotic bottle in Canada, no matter where it comes from. The only population we have to be particularly vigilant about is those who have severe immune-compromised conditions. Otherwise, most of the symptoms are temporary, and when the product is discontinued, the symptoms go away. Just a little note about yogurt cultures, because often people or companies will call yogurt cultures probiotics, or a yogurt product a probiotic. And of course, there's many food products which we'll call functional foods that claim to have probiotics in them. Well, there are some cultures that have been traditionally used to make yogurt. These cultures cannot survive the gastrointestinal tract, so they don't really meet the definition of a probiotic. It doesn't mean they don't have benefits, because there may be benefits to what they leave behind. For example, their dead bodies may act as a probiotic fiber. Now, some companies do spike their yogurts with actual probiotics, in which case then they have added them, although albeit often in small amounts. But just be vigilant about these functional foods, because they often are an exaggeration or not really meeting the definition of probiotics. So let's talk about some strain-specific uses of probiotics before we get into the actual products. Many probiotics, as I've already alluded to, are thought of as helpful for general health, general prevention of disease, as well as to aid normal and healthy digestion. And so here I've listed a number of very specific things that probiotics of various types have been found to do. For example, some of them can produce lactic acid, acetic acid, formic acid. Some of them can sequester iron, which is important to prevent iron toxicity. So there's a lot of unique roles that probiotics have. There are certain probiotics that are known to be helpful for allergies. Some studies indicate that in children or in infants, there's a decrease in atopic eczema for those who use probiotics on a daily basis for 6 months. That reduction can be about 50%. So, in a sense, they prime the immune system not to become allergic. Adults, too, can get a reduction in symptoms of allergies, but because perhaps we miss that important period of time when one is younger, they don't always produce a cure, so they may need to be used on an ongoing basis. Here I've indicated a couple of different types of bacteria where there are some studies that show them to be helpful for allergies. These two bacteria are in all of our formulas except for two more specialized ones for women and lung health. Probiotics have also been shown to be helpful for irritable bowel syndrome. Well, at least the evidence is getting very close to definitive, but we're not there. But they seem to help a lot of those general symptoms, the diarrhea, constipation, and discomfort and flatulence. In the bold, I have highlighted some of the bacteria that are in our probiotics, in most of them, that have been shown to be helpful for IBS. There are also bacteria in probiotics that could be helpful for irritable bowel disease. This is Crohn's and ulcerative colitis is what that term means. Irritable bowel disease is thought to be an immune system reaction to our own microbiome. At least that is how some experts look at it. And so I have highlighted again 3 strains that are in our formulas that have different functions that would be conducive to someone with irritable bowel disease. For example, Saccharomyces boulardii is shown to reduce relapses in Crohn's disease. And then we have certain strains that have proved to be helpful for general vaginal health or vaginal dysbiosis. Bacterial vaginosis and vulvovaginal candidiasis are, of course, a couple of common conditions that women may be seeking probiotics for. And I've again bolded 3 of the strains out of the number that I have listed here that have been shown to have some specific efficacy in this area. There are also a lot of probiotic bacteria that have proved to be helpful for diarrhea. I've listed, for example, on the first bullet point here, a number of species that we have in our own products that are shown to be helpful for antibiotic-associated diarrhea. So let's talk about the now probiotics, and you can see here I've listed 10 of them that we carry. Here are some things that I can say about all of the now probiotics. Each and every one of those bacteria are patented and trademarked. They are all searchable on PubMed, so you need to search down to the specific strain. The strains are verified by a technology we have, a riboprinter DNA testing. So not only are they verified by third-party lab, as is the case with most companies that will receive something with a certificate, but we actually verified ourselves. They've all been subject to human clinical trials. They're all tested for acid and bile tolerance to make sure that they have some staying power. And as I mentioned, they're all genetically verified. Here is a picture of our DuPont riboprinter system that now has. So this is a molecular method that provides fast and accurate and reproducible and reliable ways of assessing bacterial strains. We also use it for other products, for example, to understand the proper origin and identity of herbs, or to make sure that there's not bacterial contamination that's dangerous in products. We are the only supplement company in North America that has such a testing ability. Here are 3 of our most popular probiotics. These are actually all the same in terms of the strains and the ratios, which is why they're all called Probiotic 10. The only difference is the doses. So the lowest is 25 billion, then we have 50 billion, and 100 billion. And there are still different opinions about what appropriate dose is, just because we're lacking in studies that can give us that kind of really solid, specific information. But generally speaking, 25 billion maybe, or lower, maybe a sort of a maintenance dose, and 50 or 100 billion maybe for somebody who has maybe acute onset of a digestive issue, or who has an existing more serious problem like Crohn's or colitis, or perhaps someone who has just taken antibiotics. This is what the label looks like for the probiotic 10 100 billion, which is our highest dose. Now here are the relative ratios of the different bacteria in all of our now probiotic 10. We don't put it like this on the label for a good reason, and that is because over time, different strains of bacteria deteriorate at different rates. Therefore, putting specific ratios on the label would be misleading in a sense that we cannot guarantee those exact same ratios at the end. What we can and do guarantee is that by expiration, there will be that number of whether it's 100 billion or 50 billion bacteria that is on the bottle. You'll also notice chicory root base at the bottom. This is a source of folliculo-oligosaccharides, which is a prebiotic or food intended to feed the bacteria in that formula just to keep them viable. It is not intended to be promoted as a prebiotic in itself, which needs to be taken in much higher doses and separately. So the now probiotic 10 100 billion is one of the highest potency single-dose probiotics on the market. And again, this may be used for those situations where which I had mentioned. It has 10 living and robust strains, as do all of the probiotic 10s. And these strains have all been tested for acid tolerance, bile salt tolerance, pepsin resistance, and pancreatin resistance. All of these are a testament to their staying power. All of these 3 products, the probiotic 10s, are also dairy-free, vegan, actually grown in a vegan medium, non-GMO, and gluten-free. We do specific adhesion testing for all of the strains. The type of testing done is in vitro, so in cell cultures using cell lines that you'd find in the digestive tract, and these tests are a good indicator of the potential to bind. Why is that important? Well, prolonging the time that a probiotic strain can reside in the intestines would increase the chances that they can come into closer contact with the intestinal immune system, and also increase the chances that they can play a role in inhibiting, displacing, or competing with other pathogens. Here's a summary of our 10 strains and the various test results. So you'll notice in the very right-hand column, here are all the test results for their ability to adhere. And the next column to the left over is the test results for their acid tolerance and acid resistance. I've already mentioned that probiotics are generally speaking quite safe, but here are just some of the many reasons why we can say that these strains in particular are very safe. For example, all of them are listed in the Qualified Presumption of Safety list by the European Food Safety Authority. A little bit more about the Now Probiotic 10 series. As I mentioned, they're all enhanced with FOS prebiotic to keep the strains viable. They are all in a plastic number 2 grade, which is especially good at protecting the bacteria from moisture. This is the greatest enemy for probiotics versus oxygen, which would be the grade 1. All of them, we can say, generally speaking, this formula maintains the integrity of the intestinal lining, supports proper intestinal motility, participates in detoxification processes, restores healthy flora, and deters other pathogenic organisms. So with regards to this last statement, let's have a look at some specific studies on these very strains. So here are 4 pathogenic bacteria that are considered very problematic, such as, for example, food poisoning with salmonella. And under them are a list of bacterial strains from our Now Probiotic 10 series that have tested and shown that they are either excellent or very good at deterring those pathogens. The 4 stars indicate that the test results were excellent, 3 stars very good, and 2 stars good. Also, quite a few of our strains have demonstrated the ability to modulate our immune system. So my first point here is some details that demonstrate how they support our adaptive immunity. Now, the adaptive immunity is going to include things like protection against viruses and bacteria, scavenging for tumors, reducing our propensity to develop allergies, and also having our own immune tolerance. So if we have a good immune tolerance, we don't develop autoimmune diseases. The second part here, you can see this was a study done on rats where they were induced with intestinal inflammation, and then one of our strains were showed in those rats to considerably reduce that inflammation and some of the side effects that would come with that type of colitis, like weight loss. And there was also a reduction in inflammation that was actually measurable. So because of some of these specific tests done, we can say that some of the potential uses for this formula could be, this may be for prevention-wise or for treatment, but they may be helpful in assisting with allergies, autoimmune diseases, ulcerative colitis, general immune support for viral and bacterial infections, inflammation, and any chronic disease really, because inflammation is often an underlying factor. Now with probiotics in general as a therapy, we have many years to go before we can refine these potential uses and sort of be more confident in terms of exact protocols, species, doses, and durations. But the results are very encouraging. We have a couple formulas specifically for children, ages 3 and above. Baridophilus, we have the regular strength at 2 billion and the extra strength, which is at 10 billion. So these particular two products are subject to all the same testing and qualities that I've already mentioned with previous ones. The dose is between 1 and 3 daily. And this also contains 10 probiotic strains. There's a lot of overlap between these strains and the previous product mentioned, but there are some more specific strains that are being tested on infants. For example, you can see the Bifidobacterium animalis lactis listed at the bottom. Studies have been done using this on preterm infants, showing that it's helpful for many gastrointestinal parameters. We have our now oral probiotic. So this is one of those very specific and single strain formulas. So it features the researched Streptococcus salivarius strain. And this holds a lot of promise to help not only, as usual, to promote a favorable gut flora, but the more specific role in the area of the mouth, ears, nose, and throat. Here is a study done looking at its role on the ear and oral cavity in healthy humans. It's a systemic review. And the 9 studies that were looked at that fit the criteria, the conclusion was that, in fact, the strain may reduce the occurrence and severity of conditions of those areas, such as secretory otitis media, so that's an ear infection, or streptococcal and viral pharyngotonsillitis in children. It's also promising for halitosis, which is the medical term for bad breath. Then we have Saccharomyces boulardii. This is a little different because it's a yeast. One of its common uses is actually to treat yeast infections. It's sort of like a yeast that pushes away the other yeast or takes up space. But in this case, I'm highlighting the fact that it is well known to reduce the risk of antibiotic-associated diarrhea. You can see here an article where a lot of the various clinical conditions that Saccharomyces boulardii has potential to treat are discussed with the various levels of evidence. So, for example, you can see that when it comes to irritable bowel syndrome, there is insufficient evidence regarding the long-term use of Saccharomyces boulardii, whereas for irritable bowel disease, evidence suggests that it might be useful for inflammation and to be helpful for conditions such as ulcerative colitis. It's also promising for H. pylori eradication, which is a very difficult bacteria to treat that usually resides in the stomach. We have our now GR8 Dophilus. This is an older formula. It has 8 strains in it. Quite a few of them are a crossover from our probiotic 10. Now, there's 2 things that are unique about this in particular. One of them is that it is enteric coated. Secondly, it's shelf stable. So these have 2 particular uses. The shelf stable, of course, for those who are traveling, or perhaps even they're a person that keeps forgetting to take their probiotic when it's in the refrigerator. They're enteric coating, so I have discussed that this is not necessary because our strains are well tested to survive stomach acid and such. However, there are still customers who We're originally told and believe that enterocoating is necessary, and so for that purpose there's a perceived advantage. It can't hurt, although it is an added cost, but we carry this one, continue to carry this one just for those customers who wish to have that property. So here is a summary of our GR8 Dophilus. The woman's probiotic is a specific formula designed to aid women in the area of support for vaginal health, and also can help with gut flora, but that's in the design. It has 3 specific strains, again subject to all of the same things I said before, strain verified, and so on. So you'll notice that the study here, which is on the 2 strains of that formula, this specific study simply shows that when given to women orally, that these strains actually do colonize the vaginal area. So that was a small pilot study. And that was, by the way, in just 7 days. This is another study done on rats using the same strains, and the outcome of this was threefold. One, the study showed, which was very interesting, that actually when taken orally, the bacterial strains were more effective than when taken vaginally. So that makes it easier for women, and sort of can rest assured that one can take these orally, even for targeting the area of the vaginal tissues. Secondly, it showed that these strains can be effective against a specific condition called bacterial vaginosis. And lastly, it showed that the efficacy of this was based, at least in part we know, on the regulation of the systemic, innate, and adaptive immune response. So it was not only working perhaps locally by competing with other bacteria, but systemically, and that was based on testing specific markers before and after the administration. Another more targeted product we have is called Respiratory Care. It has 2 strains, although the first one is the predominant strain. And the claim for this product is that it can help fight seasonal respiratory challenges. Here's the specific study based on these strains. It's a randomized controlled trial with 465 participants that were divided into 3 groups. And the main take-home point from this was that these strains demonstrated the ability in these healthy and physically active adults that they could reduce the average time to the onset of a respiratory infection, and also that if that did occur, that it was typically less severe. So this would be a good product to suggest for somebody who's approaching the winter, tends to get sick a lot, and it always goes into their chest. Here's a summary for you. So you can just sort of get an overview to refresh for all the details that I have gone through by different conditions and the various probiotics that seem more suitable for each one of those scenarios or ages. Just wanted to mention that if you're interested in other continuing education, you can enroll in our Now Productology courses online. They are free, and you can even earn free products through these programs. Thank you very much for attending.